This is the Weather Lounge here at WeatherWorks.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome back to the Weather Lounge here at WeatherWorks. I'm your host, meteorologist Brad Miller, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to listen to our weather podcast. And joining me, as always, here in the Weather Lounge is the one, the only meteorologist, Mike Mahalik. Hey there, Mike.
Hey, Brad, how's it going? Hey, we're into spring now. It's time for some spring sports, right?
Yeah, we are full force into spring. Baseball season started, a couple weeks ago. We're, brushing up the golf clubs. I already got a couple of rounds under my belt, but I'm sure we'll have plenty more to go. But things are starting to spruce up, and hey, it's that time of the year where you get really excited to get outside and do a lot more things.
It's funny when it turns into spring. It's when even it gets a little bit warm, like maybe like 55, 60 degrees, like you're like throwing the windows down in the
Yeah.
car. You're doing. I feel like it's the total opposite in the fall. In the
Yeah.
fall, it gets down to like 60 degrees, and you're like, oh man, give me a coat, give me a sweatshirt. You know,
I think it's a whole
I wonder why
different
that is.
mindset. Spring, spring, you're thinking, all right, well, I got 6 months here to do some outdoor stuff. The fall's okay. I like that first fall, crisp, cool snap. It lasts about 2 weeks. Clocks go back, and you're like, oh, well, fall. And then you're like, oh, here comes winter.
Yeah,
Complete
that's true.
opposite. But we're here to talk about springtime.
Yeah, and in this podcast, we're going to have another guest on the show, and this is meteorologist Rob Reale here at WeatherWorks. And he's not only one of our good golf buddies when we
Yeah.
can get out, all of our all of our colleagues, but um, he's also into the Director of Meteorological Services for WeatherWorks, which entails a lot of weather education for our staff.
Yeah, he wears a
Um,
lot of hats at WeatherWorks, that's for sure.
Yeah, but basically, I just wanted to kind of pick his brain a little bit about,
Hmm.
some severe weather setups, some flooding setups, and basically how WeatherWorks transitions from the winter months into the spring season. So a lot of things start changing here, and
Right.
Brad kind of, and I'm sorry, Rob kind of, spearheads that initiative to get all of our meteorologists back on track. So Brad, I think it's enough of us bantering around, but I think we ought to go to break now, and then after
Yeah,
the
yeah,
break.
yeah. We'll be back
Mhm.
here in a few minutes. Very interested to hear from Rob, that's for sure. So we'll do that right after this break. Again, you're listening to the Weather Lounge here at WeatherWorks. Stay with us.
Hey everybody, well, how many times have you been burned by a weather forecast? Well, probably a few, and it might have cost your business thousands. WeatherWorks is different. We have over 30 meteorologists to give you forecasts, notifications, and weather advice 24/7. Now that could certainly help when it comes down to making those crucial decisions, but there are even more products than that in which WeatherWorks offers, from weather data to historical reports. Call us at 908-850-8600 or visit us on the web at weatherworksinc.com. And oh, don't forget, when you think weather, think WeatherWorks.
Welcome back to the Weather Lounge. I'm meteorologist Mike Mahalik, and I'm here with Brad Miller, as always, my co-host. Brad, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. Ready to bring on our guest here.
Yeah, absolutely. And our guest today is meteorologist Rob Reale here at WeatherWorks, and he's our Director of Meteorological Services. And Rob, I think you're on the line now, and welcome to the
Good.
Weather Lounge.
We're good. Thanks for having me. This is my podcast debut for any podcast, not just the Weather Round. So it's a big day for me, and I think this means I made it, right? Like I'm kind of a big deal all of a sudden. At
You're
least I think that's what that means. Um,
you're
Like
a
that
big
Barry
deal.
Manilow song. Looks
yeah.
like we made it. All right.
Now I
Can't
do.
sing.
Let me interrupt you real quick, because correct me if I'm wrong. This is just one of many Weather Lounge podcasts that you've done, correct?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, 100%.
However, this is the first time that I've been invited on said podcast. Is that also correct?
I think
That
he's
might
trying
be.
to put a guilt trip on us.
I'm
Hey,
just
hey,
curious. Like, I'm not. I want to get my facts straight. I'm not mad. I guess I'm just disappointed. That's all.
Now,
It's
now,
just,
now,
yeah,
Rob.
that's
In
all.
our defense, you are only the second guest from WeatherWorks behind our CEO and president, Frank Lombardo.
Well,
So,
it's a consolation, I
You know,
suppose, but it doesn't make it right. Is all
you
I'm
know
saying.
what? I got to burst that bubble because we did have Sherilyn on with our
Oh,
forensic
yeah, you're right.
department,
You're right.
and we
no.
also had
The
Zach
names are gonna
Chabala
keep
on,
piling up. Who
And
else
Jim,
has been on
and
this?
Jim too.
and we did have Jim on, our long range
Oh my
expert. So,
gosh.
All
um,
right.
so Rob, you're really like the fifth-ish person
Oh, yeah, yeah.
on the
All right,
podcast.
all right, all right. Don't make me feel any worse than I already do. So
Yeah.
let's
Oh
go.
well.
Where are we going with this? Let's go. We're talking spring. We're
Well,
talking summer. We're talking flooding, severe weather, all of the above. Where do you want to start?
yeah. Well, let's start, Rob, with a little bit about you. A lot of our
Okay.
listeners out here, want to get to know you a little bit better. Where'd you start with your interest in weather? Where you went to school, where you got your education, and let's go from there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, weather, couple of different aspects. I always loved snow growing up in Northwest New Jersey, and we saw quite a bit of it up there. Also spent a lot of my time at the beaches, a lot of fishing, a lot of surfing. So wind and weather and all that stuff plays a big impact. So that was sort of where my interest sparked. I stayed local to New Jersey. I went to school and got my degree at Rutgers. While at Rutgers, I interned with WeatherWorks, and shortly after graduation, back in 2010. I'm getting old. I'm getting gray. So it's
Not as
been over
old as
10
us,
Not
years
as
man.
great
now,
as me and
but
Mike.
not not quite as not quite as gray as Mike. That's for sure. But I'm getting there.
Why
But
me?
yeah, it's been 10 years with WeatherWorks, and the rest is history. Like Mike alluded to before, the title is Director of Meteorological Services. It kind of means I do a lot and help really oversee the overall meteorological um, operations of our
Hmm.
company. So that includes some recruiting and hiring and training of the staff. It includes some managing and updating of our products and some scheduling. So really, my end goal is to make the company as good as possible from a meteorological standpoint to make sure that our product is as good as possible for our clientele and that make sure that they're getting the best weather forecast and the best weather information that they can get.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a huge role in this company. We're always trying to, better our services. We don't
Hmm.
want to just stay stale. We want
Sure.
to keep up with the new, new practices of how to forecast the weather and new strategies. So, Rob, does a great job in, keeping our staff up to date. So now that we have a little background about you, Rob, and we know that you're into the weather education side of things, I think let's just head right into spring because we talk about the winter weather. We're very heavy into the winter weather at WeatherWorks, but going into spring, we still have a lot of responsibility there, and our clients are impacted by, severe thunderstorms, flooding, and all that kind of stuff. So let's um let's just kind of explain why. I mean, obviously the change of seasons, but why does that severe weather become much more prevalent as we head into the spring months?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, as more of a broad scale picture, right? The weather's largely impacted by the jet stream and largely impacted by temperature gradients. And temperature gradients are basically where hot and cold air kind of meet up. That makes it a sharper temperature gradient. And it's usually along those areas where kind of weather happens, right? That's where you get big storms or a cold front comes through or something like that. It's the clashing of air masses that really helps drive the weather on a day-to-day and month-to-month basis. And in the wintertime, the jet stream and the temperature gradients, they kind of hang out in the US. And that's where we see a lot of those like synoptic, those widespread events where multiple states, if not an entire section of the country, is raining or snowing at once. Um, Now, as we transition into the spring, the jet stream and the temperature gradients slowly start to creep back north a little bit. And what we start to get is more of a hot and humid air mass influence. um, there's still some temperature gradients. There's still some dips in the jet stream. So we still get some active weather, but instead of cold active weather where we're focused on snow, it becomes a warmer active weather where we're focused on severe weather and just rain and flooding in general. So really a lot has to do with where you're getting temperature gradients and where air mass is colliding. That's where you're getting weather. And like we were getting at before, in the wintertime, snow is the concern. In the summertime, severe weather and flooding are the concern.
It seems like in the spring we have a lot more overlap between spring and winter weather versus as we transition from fall into winter. Yeah, I know we can get some snow early in the winter or even late fall, but it seems like it's almost like night and day in the spring where we could be 60 degrees and then the next day we could be forecasting snow, and then back to maybe thunderstorms somewhere just a couple of days later. So again, is that because of I guess that's mainly because the transition is a little more rapid, I guess, in the spring, or it just seems like there's so much more activity in the March April timeframe versus like an October November December timeframe.
Yeah, I mean things bounce around a little bit more, right? It's if you think of the atmosphere as a big fluid and this kind of like windy road sort of deal,
Hmm.
that's sort of what happens with the jet stream, right? It kind of goes up and down, and depending on where you're at, might be on the warm side or the cold side. And yeah, in the wintertime, we're kind of just generally cold. In the
Hmm.
summertime, we're kind of just generally hot. And those transition months, particularly the spring more so than the fall, is
Right.
kind of where you go from warm to hot to warm to cold, and then eventually it just becomes in the summertime warmer, hot. So
Right. And
yeah,
you know,
yeah, we're
even
definitely in that transition period, and the spring does create some kind of wild weather and some big time temperature swings, more so than some of the other months.
So, Rob, let's get right into it, though. When we're talking about severe threats heading into the warm season, what are we exactly talking about? I mean, mostly severe thunderstorms, correct?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's plenty of things, and I guess even more basic before we get there is for our clientele in particular, or really anybody that's impacted by outdoor weather, just the
Hmm.
being workable or not is really important for them too, right? Like severe weather and flooding obviously are kind of the more significant impacting things, and obviously I want to touch on that, but just the fact that a day is workable or not is a big deal to our clients. And when I say workable, it means okay, if you're paving or landscaping or doing some outdoor construction, can you work in the weather or not? And a lot of times the biggest influence on that would be raining or not raining, but there's also considerations like wind, or extreme heat or extreme cold or whatever. So really at the core, before we even get to severe weather and flooding, especially for our clientele, is
Hmm.
we're really focused on, is this day workable for you as a road department, as a landscaper or contractor? Can the schools have their outdoor sports? Is there a lightning concern? So even that, I guess we'll take that a step backwards and talk about that real quick, and then obviously we'll talk about the severe weather and the flooding in a second.
Yeah, and you got a really good point there because I mean, a lot of our clients, different aspects about the weather affect them differently. You might not even think of what might be important, like even the winds at times. For the lawn care people out there, they're trying to get fertilizer down, and if you have gusty winds, you can't effectively spread fertilizer evenly over a lawn. So
And we
even
have
stuff like
professional
that.
soccer teams that are constantly making sure their grass is good. You know, the soccer players, they need pristine conditions out there.
Hmm.
So, yeah, wind's a big deal, rain's a big deal for these guys.
Hmm.
Lots of little things that you may not even consider that make a big deal on a day to day basis that are seemingly not, severe or flooding or
Hmm.
anything like that, but they have just as big, if not bigger, of an impact on clientele from a day to day basis.
Yeah, and we do say like a lot of our business happens in the wintertime, but honestly, the spring and the summer are getting busier and busier because more of our clients need this information to be more efficient when they're out there doing their job or trying to make their company run nice and smoothly. So,
Yeah,
you
so
know,
honestly, first and foremost, right now, we're really focused on providing that extra detail and that actionable information for our clients just to determine if they can work or do their projects or activities that they have planned outside. So first and foremost, that's sort of what our mindset is at the moment as we transition into the warm season months.
I love that word, actionable. Yeah, I mean that's a perfect description of what we try to pinpoint when a certain project can get done, and we actually have projects that come into us or forecasts when there's maybe something being filmed even and things like that, where we really have to pinpoint exactly the best time for rain and things like that, and that's kind of what we really try to focus on in the spring and summer months.
Now, I will say that's sort of more of the boring side of summer weather, right? The more, I don't want to say glamorous, but the more attention grabbing would be the severe weather and the flooding, which I think is what we want to get to at this
yeah.
point, right? So where do we want to go? We want to start with severe weather
Yeah,
and,
let's just talk about severe weather first, Rob, because
okay.
that's one of our main, drivers of what we need to forecast in the summertime. Let's talk about it. what are the ingredients that we need for severe weather here? And, we're based in the Northeast, so that might change a little bit throughout the country. But if you can kind of go through that a little bit, and that might
Yeah,
help some of our listeners out there.
I mean, sure. So to get a thunderstorm, period, there's kind of like three basic ingredients, which is moisture, instability, and lift. What do I mean by moisture? Well, in kind of the simplest way would be the more moisture near the surface, so the higher the dew points, kind of those sticky days, that's kind
Mm.
of ingredient one. And if you think about it, right, how often do you get a thunderstorm when it's like dry or cool out? Not that common. But when it's hot and humid, you're probably walk outside and you could pretty much be a meteorologist and be like, I bet there's going to be a thunderstorm
Yeah.
today, and half the time there is. So moisture would be sort of the first ingredient, and that's also why you get a lot more thunderstorms in the summer than the winter. Has to do with the increased moisture and humidity, particularly near the surface. The second thing I said was instability. So instability, in kind of more of a meteorological term, would be the amount of CAPE, which is the convective available potential energy.
Mm.
CAPE. It's a term that you'll probably hear sometimes. It basically quantifies how much energy there is for a storm to develop or strengthen. So the more unstable the atmosphere is, the more volatile it is, and the higher the chance there's going to be for actual thunderstorm activity. While if it's more stable and there's less instability, less CAPE, then there's going to be a less chance for thunderstorms just because the atmosphere isn't ripe for that. So we got moisture, we have instability, and the last thing would be lift. Lift is sort of like some kind of forcing that drives little air parcels upwards. And what happens when air parcels get lifted is they condense into water droplets and essentially you get weather. So those three things, moisture, instability, and lift, are the three things to get a basic thunderstorm. A lot of times that extra ingredient that you need is called wind shear. So you get all of those ingredients, you get the thunderstorm, and then the wind shear, which is essentially a wind gradient, thinking from the surface upwards through the atmosphere. So it might be like 10 miles per hour near the surface. It might be like 20 miles per hour, a couple thousand feet in the sky. And then it might be like 50 miles per hour once you get like a couple miles up in the sky. And that gradient from 10 to 20 to 50 miles per hour is called wind shear. And when you have enough of that, not only do you get the thunderstorms from the moisture, instability, and lift, the shear helps those storms organize and maintain themselves, and that's when they can take on those more severe characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good overview of everything. I want to kind of swing back to the initial setup though, because we talked about moisture and CAPE.
Yeah,
Um, there was, I mean, how many days sometimes where you just have such a soupy air mass, but nothing happens,
Yeah.
sure.
And why is that? Because we're missing the lift, or I like to call it the trigger mechanism,
Yep.
to basically light up the atmosphere like a match. So, what are those kind of trigger mechanisms that will force those thunderstorms to form? Because there's sometimes I'm waiting there and it's 90 and humid. And I'm like, oh, I wish there was a thunderstorm right now, and
Yeah.
and nothing goes on. So what does force those?
Yeah, and it's a good point. Is you need moisture, instability, and lift. Notice I said and, not or. You kind
Hmm.
of need all three. And some examples of lift or forcing or a trigger, whatever you want to call it, a common would be a front, right? Think about those collision of air masses that we talked about before, and one of the driving factors in day-to-day weather is frontal boundaries, and where you kind of have warm air meeting up with colder air. So a cold front's a really common one, which is kind of more of an obvious one, and sometimes that's where you get these widespread thunderstorm days that are also somewhat severe. But sometimes it's a little bit more subtle than that too. It could be little sea breeze boundaries, right? You're at the beach. It might start off in the 80s, and all of a sudden it drops into the 70s because the sea breeze moves through. Well, eventually, a couple miles inland from the beach, it's still going to be 90, meeting, kind of colliding with 70-degree weather. That's a front, right? It's this little sea
Hmm.
breeze front that happens just about every day at the beach that you may or may not notice. But sometimes even something as subtle as that can cause lift or be that trigger to
Hmm.
thunderstorms. So a lot of times it's these little subtle boundaries or little subtle fronts that help spark the convection, and then you do get the thunderstorms.
And sometimes that's all you need to really get even a I don't want to say widespread, but you get numerous then storms because, like Mike was saying, even you light a match, or it's almost like dominoes. You get that first one,
Yep.
and then it actually can produce other storms. One dies out, and then the outflows, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well,
That
Mike
creates
was
other storms to develop.
Yeah, Mike was just saying, he's like, "Hey, sometimes in those hot, humid days, I'm waiting for a thunderstorm." Why? Why did he say that? Because it's going to cool things down. It may still be a lot really humid, but it's going to feel a little bit better. But eventually, right? So you do get a thunderstorm in this one particular spot, and all of a sudden it goes from 90 to 70. But the town over, still 90 degrees. Mike's house 70 degrees. There's another little temperature boundary that just set up. This one was induced because of thunderstorms, but all of a sudden, like Brad was getting at too, these outflow boundaries of these cooler air from the rain cooled air that just fell meet up with the still stagnant hot humid air masses, and sometimes that's enough to trigger another storm, and then it just kind of dominoes effect, and then you just keep going and going and going during the daytime and the afternoon when you have that peak heating. So yeah, it's another little subtle trigger, is just the fact that there was a thunderstorm. It can help trigger other thunderstorms because you kind of make their own temperature gradients next to each other.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people need to know too is that the cold air is obviously, it's not well obvious to many, but it's more dense than warm moist air. So when that undercuts that warm moist air, it forces that
Forces it
air
upward. Yeah.
upwards, because it's kind of undercutting it there. So that's kind of what's happening too. So that's why the importance of that, rain cooled air is there too. So those are the basic, elements that we need here, to force, the thunderstorms to develop. But what makes those storms severe, Rob? You mentioned something about severe or wind shear a little bit. But what kind of, gives a normal thunderstorm and kind of pushes that normal thunderstorm over the edge into severe limits?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because there could be a whole lot that goes into it. And I guess, before we get there, there's sort of like three types of severe weather, right? You have gusty, damaging winds would be one thing, which is the most common type of severe weather. Hail would be another form of severe weather that you can get as well. And then the least frequent, luckily, but obviously the most impactful and sometimes devastating would be tornadoes. So those are kind of the three types of severe weather. And they all share the same theme, that you want increased moisture, increased instability, and a better lift or trigger mechanism and better shear. And that was the other ingredient that I had mentioned before, is you need all those thunderstorm ingredients plus wind shear. And kind of the more of everything that you have, the increased chance that you have for any given type of severe weather. Now, if we're getting a little more specific, what are some of the things that we're looking to get damaging winds? Well, it's a little interesting. We talked about before how we're getting precipitation and weather and thunderstorms by rising air, by those
Mm.
lifting mechanisms. So when you're talking about wind damage, though, you kind of have to think in opposite terms. How can we get air to sink really fast? And kind of, think about a thunderstorm. You have all this really heavy rain. It creates this sort of sinking motion, right? It just makes sense that all this heavy rain droplets, if it's really, really heavy, is going to drag down all this air. And if the different atmospheric ingredients are kind of all aligned, what'll happen is that downward push of air will eventually hit the ground, and then it'll expand outward, right? Almost think of like a bomb, for instance. You have that visual where something falls and then you see that outward push of air, and that's where you can get some damaging winds, and that's what's called a downburst or a microburst. So that's how you get the damaging winds, is from rapidly downward sinking air hits the ground, and then you get this push outward that could produce those 40, 50, 60, 70 plus mile per hour wind
Mm.
gusts. Now, what are some of the ingredients that you're going to look for? More cape, more shear, and also what you want is dry air in the mid levels, because what happens is if you have dry air in the mid levels, when it does start to precipitate, you get evaporation, right? When you get, or I'm sorry, yeah, it evaporates and condenses. That dry air goes away because now you're starting to precipitate, and that has a downward effect and downward push of air. So it's getting a little more technical, but the short story is you want a lot of cape, you want a lot of shear, you want thunderstorms to be likely, and you want a little bit of extra dry air in the mid levels to help push air downwards and increase that sinking motion. So that's kind of like
Mhm.
severe type 1. Good so far?
Yeah,
Yep.
100%. Now, we did touch upon tornadoes a little bit.
Yep.
Now, there's a big difference between tornadoes in the Northeast and tornadoes that may occur in, the plain states or maybe the South. I mean, for example, not long ago there was a EF4 tornado that hit Noonan, Georgia, and
Yeah.
pretty much, really destroyed things. And it's a lot more in the Northeast. I'm looking for the word here, Rob, but I mean, it's more well developed and maybe easier to pick out in the tornado alley and stuff like that than it
Yeah.
is here in the Northeast. Maybe explain what's going on there a little bit.
Yeah, so kind of Tornado Alley kind of is considered to be the Plains states, and Oklahoma and Kansas out there, and then the second Tornado Alley would be sort of the Southeast states, which includes Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, and that secondary one in the Southeast is where we've had a couple of outbreaks already this year. Um, in those two kind of Tornado Alley corridors, the atmosphere tends to get more ripe. You tend to get extra moisture, you get extra instability, extra lift, you get extra wind shear. All those ingredients that we talked about, just in the right setup, can align, and then you can get those big time tornadoes that not only are EF3s or EF4s with incredible wind speeds, but they also are longer tracked
Right.
tornadoes. They last over a very long distance, and part of the reason they do that, the only way to really do that is that you have really good lift and kind of forcing to help keep them going along. So you're not going to get that in just a stagnant hot and humid air mass. You're going to need all those ingredients that we talked about before to not only develop the thunderstorm and tornado, but to maintain it and allow it to track over 20, 30, 50 plus miles in some instances. So
Yeah.
out there, it's kind of, if you were to look at an atmospheric sounding, which is sort of like a profile of the atmosphere in one little snapshot looking down up, they call it a loaded gun sounding. Basically, it means that all the ingredients are there. All you need is a storm to pop, and things are going to go downhill fast. They get those loaded gun soundings in the plains and in the southeast, but in the northeast, where we're more focused, we don't really get the same loaded gun sounding. A lot of our air masses become modified, and while you can still have all those ingredients, they typically just don't align, and we don't quite get that same loaded gun. It doesn't take much to produce big time severe weather and tornadoes. We kind of get a modified version of that in the northeast states.
Yeah. And I think what makes it difficult too, since it is such a marginal setup a lot of times in the Northeast, when you're trying to pick out these tornado signatures on radar, they're much smaller. They're much
Yeah.
more compact in the Northeast, and they don't last as long either. So it's very difficult to get out that long lead time sometimes because these storms are, very brief with their circulations. Whereas, you're in the plains, you get this long track supercell, which a supercell is, basically a rotating thunderstorm,
Yep.
which can produce a tornado. And it's so easy. It kind of looks like a hook on the radar. It's very easy to kind of pick it out and see where it's heading in general, I should say.
Yeah, yeah, not easy, but it's definitely more obvious, or really more textbook, right? If you're gonna like
Yeah,
look up what's a tornado or what's a supercell, you're gonna see an example from Tornado Alley. They're definitely not gonna show an example of the
yeah,
Northeast, because
no,
by no means is it like that classic textbook look. 99 out of 100 times at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
yeah,
now, Rob, one other thing. Mike and I talked about this before. I think in our other severe weather podcast. But how much does topography, lend to the Northeast not having these long and one thing we always talk about, and Mike and I covered this a little bit, was just because you live in the mountains doesn't mean you can't have a tornado. But again, you're not going to get those long track tornadoes in the Northeast, like you said, in the tornado alley
Yeah.
areas and things like that, because probably I guess it's a lot flatter and it's not really disrupting the flow. I guess is that kind of a true statement? I guess.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think honestly the bigger reason is just all the other ingredients just aren't quite as
Right.
good in the Northeast, but topography can certainly play a little bit of a role in there as well. Um, and for a little bit of reference too, like, Mike threw out EF4 tornado happened in Georgia. Those are the higher end kind of tornadoes. the areas that we're covering in the Northeast, we haven't had an EF4 in a long time.
Wow.
So a lot of the tornadoes that we get are more of like EF1s, almost EF1s, which have a wind scale of like 86 to 110 miles per hour. Maybe once a year, twice a year, we'll get an EF2 somewhere in this area that touches down for like a couple miles. It isn't a long-lived thing. EF2 would have winds of 111 to 135 miles per hour, but EF3s or above, they are few and far between in our neck of the woods. By the time you're getting to EF3, by the way, you're talking 136 miles per hour or
Hmm.
greater. We don't
Mm.
get a lot of those. While it's really not that difficult, given the right setup for the plains or for the southeast states to get one. And like Mike said, just a few weeks ago at the end of March, there was an EF4 that went through Georgia.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, let's shift gears. I don't want to cut the severe discussion short here because I know that's very interesting to many people out there. But we also got to talk about flooding because flooding is, I don't know, it's a kind of like a sleeper severe
Hmm.
impactor where maybe they don't consider it as, maybe some people out there don't consider it as impactful to them. But it's one of the number one problems, I would say.
Yeah, and it almost seems like every single year we see the same video of cars trying to drive through flooded out roads and things like that. And you can't, you just, you got to get it into people's minds. You don't do that. I mean, it doesn't take much water to move a car.
Yeah,
And,
and
and
sometimes
that's the
it's not
biggest
as
issue.
it's not as dramatic as turn around, don't drown, which obviously, very much is a true statement. But a lot of times it's turn around, don't ruin your car or put yourself
Yeah.
in a vulnerable situation. That's almost just as true, or certainly more relatable, as opposed to something as dramatic as turn around, don't drown, which certainly can happen in flooding situations. But yeah, I mean, flooding, like you guys were saying, it I think it on a more I think it does impact more people on a seasonal basis, especially in the Northeast where severe weather, like we're getting at, certainly happens, but it's generally more isolated and a little bit more toned down. I don't think that's the same thing for the Midwest and the Southeast states where severe weather and tornadoes are extremely a huge factor. I mean, there's tornado sirens. People are taking huge precautions out there. It really is a different world, and severe weather by all means is probably more impactful than flooding in those tornado alley areas. But when you get to the Northeast, obviously severe weather is a factor. It is important. We want to make sure we're on top of it and we want to be aware of it. But I think on a more tangible feel, I think more people experience flooding more often in the Northeast than they do severe weather. And flooding really can happen in multiple different ways. It could be the basic poor drainage and roadway flooding, where it rains really heavy and it basically overwhelms the drainage systems that are in place and sort of builds up in ponds on the roads, and eventually you get a couple inches, or in some cases that are more extreme, a couple of feet of water buildup on a road.
Mm.
And obviously that can be really hazardous. Another type of flooding would be streams and creeks, which tends to be a little less frequent than just the poor drainage roadway flooding. The streams and creeks are a little less frequent, but they can be a little bit more severe, where you have those, I don't know, think of like a 5 to 20-foot wide stream or creek in the area. And sometimes you don't even notice them. Sometimes they're just little like gullies alongside of a road that have little to no water buildup. But if those become overwhelmed, you get a couple inches of rain real quick, those can overflow. And because more water gets channeled in those streams and creeks, wherever that kind of meets up with a roadway or person's property can cause some pretty significant damage as well in terms of flooding. So we have poor drainage and roadway flooding, we have streams and creeks, and then we have the major river flooding, which is the rarest of the flooding. But then we're talking about rivers that are humongous, that can cause big time issues. But luckily, that's the kind of the most rare form of flooding. So those are the three types that we usually break in categories. Like we said, hey, there's wind damage, hail damage, and tornadoes with severe weather. With flooding, there's poor drainage roadway flooding, there's streams and creeks flooding, and then there's major river flooding.
Yeah. So with the freshwater flooding, which is what Rob just talked about, so what kind of goes into that? What makes that setup worse? Basically, what makes it more impactful if you're going to get a flooding day like that?
Yeah, and I mean, again, you can get that basic poor drainage roadway flooding with almost any thunderstorm, right? It rains heavy enough, you get a quick inch, inch and a half in 30 minutes or an hour or whatever, and yeah, you're going to have some ponding, and it might be a little bit treacherous, but nothing crazy. It's something that Florida sees every day in the summer, and you never hear about major flooding issues because it's generally minor, and the soil down there can handle the rain, and so on and so forth. Um, when you get those worse than normal flooding days, a lot of times it's where thunderstorms focus in a particular area for a longer time than normal. And a lot of times that happens along our friends that we've been talking about, those frontal boundaries. A lot of times, if
Mhm,
there's a frontal boundary that's sitting in the same area, that's going to be the source for convection and the source for longer lasting thunderstorms. And it's when you get those thunderstorms that sit over the same place for 1 hour or 3 hours or whatever it is, instead of just getting that quick 1 inch of rain that causes nuisance issues, you get 3 or 4 or 5 inches of rain, which
mhm.
causes much greater impacts and more significant flooding issues.
Yeah, and that's more of the training situation that we like to call it in the
Yep.
meteorological industry,
Yep.
where these, like you're explaining, those storms kind of go over the same areas one after the other, and it just keeps adding up. And also, it's not only where the storms are training, it's actually, the what
Mhm.
is the actual geography of the place? Is it more of urbanized or is
Yep.
it more rural that makes the flooding situation worse? And basically, the urbanized areas, you have a lot of things that are paved rather than just grass areas. So the water basically has nowhere to soak into the ground, so it just runs off and collects in these drainage ditches and overwhelms things, and that's where you do get um, a lot of those flooding issues. I mean, one example is Northeast New Jersey, right, Rob?
Mm,
Oh, definitely. I mean, the
hot
95
spot.
corridor in general, way more prone to flooding in any given day than 30 to 50 miles to the northwest, where it's more rural. There's less infrastructure. So, yeah, that's a good point too, is that flooding is most prone where we're most populated, right? So,
Mm.
that's certainly kind of feeds into the reason why I think flooding is a little bit more tangible and we experience it a little bit more is because we're literally putting ourselves in harm's way, so to speak. We've basically built an infrastructure where flooding is going to be more prone just because of how the land has been developed. We didn't get to coastal flooding yet. I don't know if we will or not, but there's another instance where we're putting ourselves in harm's way, right? It's really nice to have these beachfront properties, but it also makes you really, really vulnerable.
Well, let's go right into that, Rob. Coastal flooding. I mean, I know you're a big beach nut for the New Jersey
Sure.
Shore there, and I know you're big into fishing too. So you're really into the coastal areas and the impacts there. So let's go over that a little bit. So, what creates the coastal flooding? Is it just the tides, or is there more to that?
Yeah, no, there's a lot to it. I guess the basic thing you need is it's really how high the tides are getting. And on any given day, the height of the high tides and low tides are going to fluctuate. Basically, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with going to the beach, but some of you may not be. And you'll hear the term high tide and low tide. And what that has to do is really the moon actually impacts the tides and the gravitational pull. So what you'll have, especially in it's not always this, but for at least the East Coast and for New Jersey area and New England and the Mid Atlantic, there's typically two high tides a day and two low tides a day. So right off the bat, if you're going to have coastal flooding, you need higher than normal water, so you're more prone to have coastal flooding at a higher tide than a lower tide. So that's sort of like one thing. And how high those tides are on a given day does fluctuate too. It's not like the same height every single day of the year, depending on the gravitational pull of the moon will dictate because some tides through the course of the year are higher than others. So right off the bat, those higher than normal tides, and there's actually a term for the highest astronomical tide, naturally occurring tide through the year. It's called the king tide.
King
Um,
tide. Yeah.
Again, right off the bat, if you're at a high tide and you're at a particularly higher than normal high tide, your risk for coastal flooding will be a little bit more increased. Now, that alone won't cause issues. It's when you start to increase the surge, basically pushes up the water levels higher than they should be. It's the surge that starts to cause issues. How do you get surge? Well, there's a couple different ways. the basic way would be a constant onshore wind where the wind is pushing in from the ocean and it constantly is in the same direction over a long area and a long duration, and it builds up water. It doesn't allow the oceans and the bays to receive water naturally. It kind of just slowly and surely builds them up. So that's one way to increase surge. Another way would be with some sort of low pressure system that maybe if there, particularly happens in a tropical cyclone or a hurricane, um, that adds like an extra push of water just from the sheer size and impact of that storm. That's going to add surge to your area as well. So those are sort of the two basic ingredients would be increased wind coming from the water and some sort of low pressure, particularly a tropical cyclone that also pushes more water towards the land. Those things make up the surge. And then if those things are happening at a high tide, that you're already a little bit more vulnerable than normal, that's where you get the coastal flooding.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, people in the Northeast can certainly think about Sandy
Sandy, yeah.
and about how large of a storm that was, and how much water was being pushed in from that constant onshore wind when that storm was making that, left turn directly into the East Coast. So,
Yeah,
um,
and with that storm too, Mike, obviously that was particularly for the New York City area and a lot of New Jersey, really one of the most devastating storms in terms of storm surge. Um, but what you may not have realized, or may not have, you probably didn't if you weren't at the coast, is that even 24 to 48 hours before Sandy ever made landfall, there was this, we call it this fetch, where basically the winds were from the northeast for a day or two ahead of time, and you weren't even really getting the impacts from Sandy itself yet. You were just getting that constant onshore flow. People were already experiencing coastal flooding before Sandy ever got there. So by the
Hmm.
time we got there, things were already primed. They were already kind of bad, and then Sandy made it that much worse with that extra push of water from the storm itself. So there was a couple different things going on, and for some, it wasn't just this, 1 day coastal flooding event. It was kind of like a 3 or 4 day coastal flooding event that had one really bad day on top of it.
I didn't even know that.
yeah, and then plus you also had the angle at which the storm made impact into the Northeast. It wasn't
Yep.
like a glancing blow where it was just grazing along the shoreline. It came directly perpendicular into the shoreline, which is
Yep.
basically maximizing your, storm surge that you're going to get with that storm.
Yeah, and tropical really storms in general in the northern hemisphere will spin counterclockwise, right? So like if you're looking at a clock, think the opposite of how it's going. And if you're thinking about a storm moving in a direction, let's just say the storm's moving due north. So you're getting kind of a push with the storm moving from south to north. And then you're also getting a counterclockwise spin around that motion. So if you're on the right side of the storm, to the north, not only are you getting that storm approaching your area pushing water, but that counterclockwise wind around the storm is kind of even more enhancing that push forward. So if you're in the northeast side of a storm, and particularly a hurricane, that's usually where the surge is the worst. And that's where New
Mhm.
York City was and most of New Jersey was in this storm. We were in the northeast side of that storm relative to where it was moving, as it pretty much came from off the coast and it made a hard turn, went right and made landfall around Cape May, Atlantic City. So anywhere just to the north of there is where it had the worst surge and the greatest coastal flooding impacts.
Yeah. And I know we use Sandy here as an example here for the Northeast, but this happens anywhere, tropical storms and hurricanes make landfall. I mean, one particular would be obviously Katrina down in New Orleans,
Hmm.
and that had the same sort of situation where it was basically a worst case scenario where that right front quadrant just made that impact right into New Orleans, and then obviously the levees broke and everything else went downhill from there for
Yeah,
New Orleans.
it's the northeast side of these storms have the worst surge, and then it's
Hmm.
usually the western side that has the heaviest rain, usually.
Yeah, and it's funny, and you talk about rain just there too. Keep in mind that rain can exacerbate the situation too if you already have flooding, right, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, coastal flooding, I think a lot of people think of it as the ocean is overcoming the beaches and flooding onto the land. More times than not, that's not really how you get the coastal flooding, especially, on the East Coast. over the last 10, 20 years, we've really built up the dunes really well. So it's pretty tough to get flooding from the beach over the dunes onto the land. If that happens, it's extremely bad, but it's pretty rare. And honestly, at this point, some of the highest points on any like a barrier island, for instance, tend to be like right along the beach. They tend to have the highest elevation. It might only be 8 or 10 feet above sea level. Um, but that's not commonly how you get coastal flooding. More commonly, what happens is where you're lower in elevation, maybe where the roads are, your house is only a couple feet above sea level. What happens is their drainage systems, right? And what will commonly happen is just the fact that the tides are increasing and the surge is increasing, the water has to go somewhere. So more commonly, it will almost come through the drains that we've created, and you kind of get flooding from the ground up.
Right.
Is the more common way you're actually going to get coastal flooding. It's not like the water's overflowing the beaches. That's an extreme case, but on a more common scale, that does happen several times a year. In some instances, 20, 30, 50 times a year, depending on where you're at and how vulnerable you are. It's kind of coming from the ground up. And like Mike was saying, if you're already getting coastal flooding where the drains are already backed up because the tides are higher, and then you have falling rain on top of that, where's it going to go? It's just going to kind of add insult to injury at that point. And that's where you can get even worse flooding, is the combination of the coastal flooding in addition to the rain falling on
Hmm.
top of it.
No, that's a good point there, Rob, because I lived in Charleston for several years out in South Carolina, and we mentioned the king tides earlier, and we would have flooding. I mean, I didn't live in downtown, but there would be times where we would be under the king tide for a couple of days, and like you said, you would flood from the ground up, and there'd be instances where roads were closed
Yep.
because the influx of the seawater coming up out of the drainage areas. I mean, right around high tide, you'd be closed. Certain roads would be shut down. And these are susceptible roads that would happen almost all the time when this
Yep.
flooding occurred. But they'd be shut down for 2, 3 hours either side of high tide because of that. And it's just amazing that you think about that. And yeah, it's it even happens in New Jersey and a lot of the coastal areas here in the Northeast. So it's a perfect example.
Yeah, I think that the term sometimes used is fair weather flooding, right? It could be sunny and
Exactly.
beautiful
It'd be
out.
sunny and it'd be why is the road closed due to flooding? It hasn't rained in 3 days.
And speaking of vulnerability before, there's places that without any surge whatsoever, right? Without that added water from the wind or from a low pressure coming, there's places that will naturally reach flood stage just by being there on a day-to-day basis. Like, we've
Right.
built things in a vulnerable position that there will be flooding, and usually it's kind of nuisance and minor flooding, and it, like Brad was saying, it floods the same roads that are always used to it. So you're kind of prepared, and it just sort of becomes a
The
cycle
new
of
norm.
life. But
Yeah.
it doesn't take much on top of that to make it a lot worse. And we basically put ourselves in positions where you can get worse than normal flooding with not a lot of surge buildup, just because of how vulnerable and how easy it is to get that just right off the bat.
And that kind of brings us, I guess we'll wrap up with this last subject, but and it kind of goes along the lines of back bay flooding. To talk a little bit about that, because that's something that only probably localized people would understand, and a lot of folks don't see. Well, what's back bay flooding? I mean, if flooding's one thing, I mean, what does it mean to have back bay flooding?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's all kind of related, right? And again, I think just most people, and it makes sense. Like, you think of coastal flooding, you think of the ocean being crazy and water going onto the beach and then spewing into the town and whatnot. But a lot of times it either comes kind of up through the drains, or the back bays that are kind of more channelized and secluded. The water builds up there, and there you get flooding as well. And a lot of times too, the back bays and the communities around them are the closest to sea level. They're just not high up. There's no elevation there, so they end up on a guess on a more common basis, seeing that more nuisance to moderate flooding. They actually see more of it than the oceanfront properties itself, but it's when those big storms hit that the ocean fronts can really see the brunt of it. So it's kind of like the back bays see more common flooding, but it's the oceanfront that would see the more extreme flooding on
Sure.
a kind of rare basis, maybe on the order of one every 10 plus years, as opposed to the back bays and just some low lying areas can see nuisance flooding 10, 20, 30 times a year.
Yeah, I mean, let's start pivoting off that flooding issue. I mean, great summary of everything, Rob. But now that we covered all the severe weather and the flooding issues that we deal with, let's talk a little bit about what we do to prepare, here at WeatherWorks for these severe weather threats into the summer.
Yeah, I mean, a whole lot. We've really grown a lot in the last, particularly 10 years. I mean, the company's been around since 1986. I started in 2010. There, Mike was there at the time as well. Brad
Hmm.
was still down in Charleston golfing it up, but
Yeah.
we had maybe a dozen meteorologists at that point, and now we're at a staff of over 30 meteorologists. So we've grown a lot, and a lot of that has to do with the preparation that we take and the training that we implement before the season and during the season. So we're kind of, and I think we talked about it earlier, where
Hmm.
we're starting to get from that winter mindset to that green mindset, right? The green industry meaning, you know, construction, paving, landscaping, mulching, growing grass, whatever. So first and foremost, we want to make sure we're in that mindset. We want to make sure that our forecasts are always adding value. We're not just telling people there's a 30% chance of rain. We're talking about how it might impact them and help them plan out their day. Is that 30% chance in the morning? Or they might have to start a little bit later, and the first couple hours might be a washout? Or is it just a 30% chance for an afternoon sprinkle and it really won't affect whatever you're doing whatsoever? So, first and foremost, we want to make sure our clients understand, can they do their day to day task? And if they can't, when can they at least get some of that work in still?
And I think a really good point that you made, Rob, is that we're just not putting out there the 30% chance of rain. We really tailor these forecasts to what those clients are actually doing. You can get a 30% chance of rain anywhere, but if you're talking to one of our meteorologists at WeatherWorks, it's totally different because we're going to want to know, what you're doing for the day, how sensitive it is to rain. Can you get away with a little bit of rain or not? And we'll
Right.
tailor our consultation to those needs.
Right, there may be a big difference between like a landscaper out there just trimming trees or cutting grass versus someone that wants to put on a new roof who doesn't want really any rain, but you can mow grass through like some light rain or even like putting down pavement and things like that. You really don't want much rain with that because you need it to dry. But
Mm.
certain projects you can get away with some rain, but other clients they can't have any rain. So it's either how, like you said, Mike, how sensitive is their project that they're going to be doing or task that day.
Yeah, it's that added layer of not only understanding the weather and giving an accurate forecast, but it's understanding the clients
Right.
and kind of bridging the gap between weather and decision support. That's what we're really
And
looking
they'll
for.
call actually about that, which is helpful to us as a meteorologist, and we're trying to forecast for that area. Somebody might call and say, "Yeah, I got a big paving project tomorrow. When is this rain actually going to get in here? Is there enough time for it to dry? Or we're going to be tearing up a roof for the next 3 days. Can we basically expect all dry weather? Because even a thunderstorm, when you expect a 3-day stretch of dry weather, could really throw a wrench into that when you got half of a roof on a house down.
Yeah, yeah, that's never good. Clients don't like an empty roof,
No.
open roof with a thunderstorm. That's
Right.
never a good combination.
And one thing that we didn't even touch on, because it's not technically severe weather, I would say, even though it's very dangerous, is lightning.
Yeah.
A lot of our clients are concerned about lightning, whether it's a stadium or some other venue or a sports team or something like that, or even a school. So Rob, I mean, I know we have some pretty good techniques. Can we kind of give them a little taste of what we're thinking about when we're trying to give some lightning notifications out there?
Yeah, I mean, and like Mike said, a lot of our clients care about lightning in general. And then we actually have clients that we specifically provide heads ups for lightning ahead of the lightning. So they'll literally get a call or a text from us before it's ever struck ground and they ever hear that
Mm,
boom. How do we do
mm.
that? Right?
Well,
Like
let's
we've
not give
become,
away too many secrets
I
now,
won't give
Rob.
away too many secrets, but
Okay.
I will say we've become experts in predicting lightning, which seems like a weird thing to predict. But lightning, if you understand it and you understand how it forms and why it forms, there's some radar techniques that we can use to assess how likely lightning is or is not. And a lot of it has to do with what's going on in the colder parts of the atmosphere, which typically is like 15, 20,000 feet in the sky. Depending on what's going on up there, clues us into how likely lightning might be and how short of a time it might take until it actually strikes. And we'll provide this consultation and we'll provide these heads up notifications to clients across our corridor that we service.
Yeah, and I mean, our clients truly appreciate that because it comes down to safety. They
Absolutely.
have players on the field. They may have fans in the stands. I mean, I know we're
Right.
in still with the COVID pandemic, but once fans do return, they have to stay safe. They can't keep fans in out there
Yeah.
when
And
lightning is in
it
the area.
really is. It's an always thing too. It's the obvious ones are when there's a big game happening or a concert, but there's also all this setup before and
Hmm.
takedown after. So like these venues that we're servicing are constantly outdoors. Or maybe there's not
Hmm.
a soccer game going on. There's a soccer camp going on,
Right.
and
Hmm.
there's tons of young ones out there playing. So it really is almost an everyday sort of concern for these clients, and we're always monitoring that for them.
Yeah, and I just got to end with the one story of lightning.
Oh, is this
Uh,
your golf course story?
no, no,
Oh, okay.
no. It doesn't have to do with myself. That's where I put myself in a
Okay.
bad
We talked
situation.
about our lightning
Yeah, that was on the golf
close call,
course,
close
and I might have
calls.
been
Yeah, well,
having a good
I think
round,
we're all
and
guilty of that.
let's
Yeah,
that was
yeah,
I was
metal
still
rods and a thunderstorm are usually not the best combination, but
yeah,
No, you don't
listen.
want to recreate the Caddyshack scene with the priest playing golf.
Listen, I was still at Penn State and training to be a meteorologist, so that's my excuse. Uh,
yeah,
it's not a good
you
excuse.
didn't know, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's really a bad excuse. Anyway, but man, I got to tell you, they were building a house in my neighborhood. I think it was about a year or two ago, and there was a guy, a construction worker, sitting on the peak of a roof when a thunderstorm was moving in. And I'm watching the lightning, bolts in the background, and I'm just thinking to myself, how long is it going to take for this guy to get off this roof? Because I'm getting nervous. And I was almost like put in a position where I felt like I should do something
Your
because
meteorological duties, right?
right, and the whole safety of the public and all that kind of stuff that we are that's our responsibility. But man, I was like this close to just getting, you have to get down, and nobody nobody would have knew who I was or nothing. I wish I would have had my hard hat from my old construction inspection days, because that
Well,
would have
you
made me
could have
look.
brought your essential employee card and be like, "Hey,
There
I'm
you
a
go.
meteorologist.
There you
It's
go.
okay.
I
I'm a
could have.
limo driver."
Very nice. I like that reference. But yeah, that was a situation. Luckily, the guy got down. I was like just about to walk over and be like, "Look, like I have nothing to do here, guys, but you got to get out of here. You
Yeah.
Yeah.
got to get off that roof. The wind's blowing, the bolts are coming." But Rob, I gotta say, I think we covered about all of it here of,
Oof.
some
Yeah.
severe weather and flooding, and what WeatherWorks does to prepare for the severe weather season. So I really, hey, thanks a lot for coming on the program. I thought it was
Yeah.
really interesting.
And since Rob was so slighted on this, maybe we'll bring him back first again before anyone else
Yeah.
for like
Well,
maybe in the fall going into winter when we get into more of
Yeah.
the winter.
I won't hold my breath. I know you got another 10 people you want to get on before me again.
Uh,
So,
Yeah.
whenever my turn is, let me know. But it's
Well,
been fun, guys. I appreciate it.
that's it for the Weather Lounge podcast. Remember, we'll have a new episode every 2 weeks, so come back and listen again on any place you get your podcast. And remember, weatherworksinc.com is our website, and also find WeatherWorks on any social media platform that's out there. So thanks everybody for joining us today.